What is up, fellow sickos? I am Dan Favale coming at you with another 2024-2025 NBA season look ahead. As you're listening to this, we have rounded the halfway point of the look ahead series. So if you have not already, what are you doing? Subscribe, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, the whole nine. Ratings and reviews on Apple help us a ton. Flood the comment section on YouTube. Also help the algo push us a little bit more, especially on our shorts, which have just died. They've completely just been smoked. I may have to pivot away from them if they don't continue to help us grow. So do all that stuff. And if you are consistently doing that, one, I love you. And so does Grant. And two, please tell people about us, share the episodes, the content, let everyone know that we have lots of fun around here and that we at least try to work really hard at covering the entire NBA. We are on to the Indiana Pacers, though, which means I have the distinct pleasure of being joined by the GOAT, Caitlin Cooper. Follow her on the Twitter machine at C2_Cooper. Just as importantly, if not more importantly, subscribe to Basketball She Wrote. Just incredible content that she puts out. It's absolutely ridiculous how good she is. I talk about her all the time on this podcast, even when she's not here. She is one of my favorite content creators of all time. She is one of the nicest people you will ever interact with as well. Very thankful that she gives us her time when I know she's super in demand because she's mainstream Caitlin Cooper, the world famous Caitlin Cooper. So go subscribe to Basketball She Wrote. The link to that is in the podcast and YouTube description as you are listening/watching to this. That's enough out of me, though. I have lots of questions about the Indiana Pacers, and Caitlin's going to have all the right answers to them because she always has the right answers to them. So let's get to talking about the 2024-2025 Indiana Pacers with the one, the only, the legendary, the GOAT, Caitlin Cooper. Caitlin, welcome back. Thank you for coming back for what's like your upteenth appearance on this podcast. Always grateful that you agreed to return. It's been too long, as I was telling you off air, because we have not spoken in podcast form since this time last year, which means the most important question of all that I'm going to ask. How the heck are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm always excited to get the return invites here. I told you I joked around ahead of time and in our message thread and said, I think this is my longest term podcast relationship, and I'm pretty sure it is.
I love it. And I was telling you before we started, you were the first person outside of my little silo of, I met them through Bleacher Report years ago that came on this podcast, which has been running since I think 2015. And I don't know when the year was that you came on, but I specifically remember because I could probably remember the DM I sent you because I get nerve-wracked, one, reaching out to people I know, but definitely people I've never interacted with before. You were kind enough to say yes, and you've been kind enough to say yes every single time since then. So, like I said, we are immeasurably grateful around these parts that you continue to come back.
I'm immeasurably grateful that the people keep letting me come back.
Please, people are foolish if they weren't going to have you on your podcast or even trying to talk about the Pacers at a high level if Caitlin Cooper is not involved. Speaking of which, though, it's funny because this time last year, we were having a conversation about what direction the Pacers were going to choose. Were they going to play the longer game or kind of commit to more of a semblance of urgency? They wind up making the Pascal Siakam trade in the middle of January. What did you sort of make about that decision to lean towards that route? Or is that even what they're doing when you look at what they did this offseason where they keep him, they focus on talent retention with Obi Toppin, and they extend TJ McConnell, Andrew Nembhard? What do we just make of the Pacers' overall direction right now?
It's interesting when reflecting back on that because I vividly remember that during preseason, I wrote a piece called Jarace Walker is going to be a microcosm of the Pacers next season. And I felt like looking at their rotation and what we had seen from him during preseason, that if he got to play, it was going to be because they were leaning more toward development. And if he wasn't playing, it's going to be because they exceeded expectations. And pretty rapidly they did. And then by the time the playoffs come around, we don't need to relitigate what the playoffs were for the Pacers. But during the Bucks series, I wrote another piece that was like they kind of did the impossible, right? Where they achieved the intersection of winning and development, where they had a series lead at the time when I wrote the piece. And I pointed out that, Ben Sheppard, they had cut out and gone down to an 8-man rotation in that series. And Ben Sheppard was one of the 8 players as a rookie, which, a lot of the talking points around Rick Carlisle at times can be that he can be harder on rookies and getting in the rotation. But that hasn't been the case for Ben Sheppard after Buddy Hield was traded. And it wasn't the case for Nembhard as a rookie. And then the piece more so centered around Andrew Nembhard, and that you could see that for a player who dealt with a kidney stone during preseason and then had the back issue and also had the hyperextended knee, that it was all coming together at the right time for him, and that the Pacers really had found 2 guys that, like, hey, these are really solid people to have in an 8-man playoff rotation as first and second year players. So in a sense, they kind of ended up doing what I was skeptical that they would be able to do. That being said, when you mentioned the things that they did this offseason and that they're virtually, pretty much bringing everybody back, sign multiple players to extensions, it's going to be very hard given that they need to kind of bank on internal development in a sense to maintain or level up on what they just did, when it's going to be really hard for them to be able to play Ben Sheppard, Andrew Nembhard, Bennedict Mathurin, and Jarace Walker. With the rotation that they have, they can't really play all four of those players, and yet two of them are very kind of integral to answering some of the holes that they have on the roster if they're ready to play, and will they be? So they kind of still find themselves in the same place, despite the fact that they did get better and they did make the run in the playoffs.
Before we kind of get into what might transpire this season or just looking ahead, was there any aspect of their offseason? I think we all knew once you traded for Pascal Siakam, he was coming back on the max. It was a question of length, 4 years, okay, whatever. Was there anything that surprised you or stood out when you're looking at the money Obi Toppin got, or both McConnell and Andrew Nembhard getting extensions?
I think for the Pacers, and I pointed this out at the time, especially of the McConnell signing, is that, and this is one of my intriguing stats that I really like to share, is that they were plus 7.39 and over 1,300 minutes played when any two of Tyrese, TJ McConnell, or Andrew Nembhard were on the floor. They found out that they were, pretty effective when they have multiple ball handlers out there, in part because teams started showing more exaggerated coverages against Tyrese. And Tyrese's role changed a little bit after they moved Buddy Hield as well. So it was to their benefit that if Tyrese is being picked up full court, if he's being face guarded a lot, that they have somebody else out there that can initiate offense, and then he's doing more as a screener, as a movement shooter. It was something I talked about before last season even picked up, where I was like, watching him at Team USA in the FIBA World Cup in the minutes that he played with Jalen Brunson, I was like, these are going to be valuable, because if he can become a better role player, it'll make him an even better star. And that was something that ended up really coming into play over the back half of the season. So I can't say I was surprised that they extended them or that they extended Obi Toppin. I think that more so with Obi Toppin, my position on it was I might have looked to see if there was somebody at that price level that might have answered, address more of their weaknesses, whereas Obi more builds out their strengths. He was one of the best play finishers in the NBA last year. He definitely fits with their play style. But I remember at the time I mentioned a player kind of like Caleb Martin, who maybe you could throw out there more against wings while still getting at least some shooting from him. And the Pacers, quite frankly, their offense is kind of a self-sustaining machine in and of itself, where I don't worry about that as much in terms of them addressing the other end of the floor. But I'm guessing they probably sniffed around a little bit and were like, maybe some of those opportunities aren't going to be there for us. We'll keep our core guys. And I think it more so as a reflection of eventually, having contracts, keeping their flexibility, because they're going to be set up for a consolidation move at some point.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised by the extensions, actually, because I think that's, especially the response to the second apron and the way teams handle themselves and the way that we've kind of been tracking, it feels like that's just the new way of things happening. Obi Toppin's contract was the one that surprised me the most. I always expected him to come back, but I looked at that and was like, well, who was giving him? We saw no restricted free agency offer sheets this year, by the way, to anybody. I was like, who was giving him that money? And I know a lot of Pacers fans, they killed what me and Grant said about their offseason. They said, well, you need these contracts to move. And I do agree. 4 years at 60. I thought the number was, and the years were a little inflated, but like you said, he is a really good play finisher. And it was exciting to see him do so well in Indy after watching him kind of be held back in New York because he just had Julius Randle constantly in front of him. And the Knicks did not want to play the way that the Pacers did, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, we actually did see some things. Like I remember Game 6 when he and TJ were really keys there against the Milwaukee Bucks when they advanced. He did several things in that game where I'm like, even the most optimistic Knicks fans, I don't think anticipated seeing Obi Toppin make a one-handed pass off his left going uphill along the three-point line, making a push shot as the roll man, making a transition three, blocking a shot with his offhand. He played a lot of minutes at the 5 in that series, which is, I'm sure we'll talk about intriguing lineups later, but that's one of my most intriguing lineup combinations to watch next season is how the minutes with Obi at the 5 bear out over a larger sample.
6 years into these look-aheads, it's clear that I dictate too much of how these podcasts go. So I've been asking everyone, what is the biggest storyline for this team, the Pacers in this case, that you'll be tracking either entering the season or throughout the entire season?
I mean, I think to an extent, it's the same storyline that's been the storyline at training camp for them the last 2 years. I remember
Myles
2 years
Turner's
ago they
future?
talked about we need. That's a tale as old as time, Dan. No, I think they talked about 2 years ago, we need to address defense and togetherness. They talked about last year, some of their requisites for people earning playing time because they had so much competition at camp was going to be, defense and unselfishness. It's going to be, what's it going to take for them to improve on the defensive end and what's a realistic expectation? I think that's going to be the overarching thing this year because, like we said, I think that they showed enough proof of concept, regardless of what the injuries were in the playoffs, to think that they can still be a very good regular season team. The offensive rating held up in the playoffs. They outscored opponents in each round of the playoffs when Pascal and Tyrese were on the floor, including against Boston, who were not nearly as banged up, obviously, as the Bucks. And the Knicks were. There's lots of little things that you can point to there, but if they're going to maintain the success that they had last year, I do think that they need to have a little bit more reliable of a defense because that's what stood out in games. The losses that they had to Boston, obviously, those were somewhat the witching hour of things that you can't really completely explain that went wrong, but also one team had a defensive foundation they could rely on. One team was more defensively versatile, and it wasn't the Pacers in those games. So that's the main thing that they need to address, and I think that's going to be the main storyline that we're going to be watching all season.
What are sort of the one or two elements that would go into this team sustaining a league average or better defense then?
Yeah, I think I had this tagline last year where I said the defense doesn't need to be good. It doesn't even need to be mediocre. It merely needs to be bad, and it's too often terrible. And that took place in a game when they had one of their 150 duels with the Atlanta Hawks. And I later issued a retraction because they did show some progress and they did make some adjustments to the scheme as the year went on. And that's what I told people. I just recently got asked a mailbag question by somebody said, what would it take to make this defense great? That's too lofty of an expectation. You need to get in the range of like bad ranging to meh. Because I will say that I think that this coaching staff, like when you look at it, I'll ask you, if you looked at the personnel on the roster, do you think that the Pacers have top 10 offensive talent? Just based on the personnel.
I might just be colored by what I know Tyrese Haliburton is, but I guess in a vacuum, you probably wouldn't look at, especially heading into last season and being like, oh, Nembhard, no Siakam. So yeah, I don't think you'd look at the roster and be like, oh, that's for sure a top 10 offensive team.
Yeah, you wouldn't think that that's going to be the number one offense in the playoffs. I doubt. And again, like some of that had to do with injuries, but not completely. Because let's face it, like Giannis is a big deal defensively, but Dame being out kind of helped the Bucks defense. Didn't make them a better team, but defensively they were better when Dame wasn't playing. So I think that they get more out of their personnel offensively. And I've told people this many times. I think they're getting about what should be expected defensively, unless you look at a few specific things. So I think last year they ranked 30th in closeouts per 100 possessions, and in part that's because they started the year really being somewhat dogmatic with the guard your yard scheme. They were going to do all pick and rolls 2 versus 2. As the year went on, they were willing to relax that. They weren't trying to, use Buddy as a primary against Giannis Antetokounmpo. They were building a 3-player wall. Some of what you saw in the Lakers in the finals of the in-season tournament where they scored 86 points in the paint while the Pacers, quote-unquote held them to 2 of 13 shooting from 3. There were changes to that specifically in the playoffs where it's like, okay, now we're seeing Siakam, even helping off of the ball side corner. He's flooding clear strong side off of Achua, off of Josh Hart in ways that they weren't necessarily as adaptable with earlier in the season. So I would expect some changes there, but I don't think that no matter what this coaching staff does with the scheme, I don't think that's necessarily going to significantly move the needle because, to be honest, while it probably wasn't what I would have done at the beginning of the season, they tried a polar opposite scheme the prior year, and both years they resulted in a bottom 10 defensive outcome, including after they acquired Siakam. They still ranked around 22nd after that. So I would look at, can Tyrese come back and be a little bit more physical? Can he take a bump and still potentially get over a screen? Because he did show that a little bit. They don't want to give up switches with him, so they use a lot of show coverage, and he got a little bit better at holding the line on that, maybe even, diverting the ball handler a little bit. So can he show a little bit more physicality and not get overpowered? Is there ways that you could potentially use Myles as more of, a weak side rim protector rather than a ball side anchor? Just dialing up their overall attentiveness. That's something that I like to point out with regard to Bennedict Mathurin, because you can dial up energy and effort. I'm not always sure how to project, awareness. It might all click for him. I don't completely know, but that's something there. And then the biggest thing, they need to address the hole that they have at the wing. Like, they still have it. Like, they acquired Pascal Siakam, and a very telling thing, the night before they acquired Pascal Siakam, they played the Utah Jazz, and Andrew Nembhard was guarding Lauri Markkanen. They acquired Pascal. They really toyed around with his role in the first, however many games that he was there. By the time you get in the playoffs, it's game 4. And when Tyrese is out and Ben Sheppard's a starter, and they can put Ben Sheppard at the point of attack, Pascal was put on Drew Holiday, and they had Andrew Nembhard and Aaron Nesmith back on Tatum and Brown. It was not Pascal Siakam doing that. So what type of role they think that they want him to have, and then just can Mathurin or Walker become that guy? Can Bennedict Mathurin or Jarace Walker be a person that you could eventually see ending up being in a starting lineup and having some impact, given that they are more wing-size wings? And I'm sure we'll get into each of their games more specifically later, but I think that the solutions more so are going to have to come from little incremental steps from various players on the roster, or eventually seeking an outside solution with the consolidation trade that we kind of alluded to before.
I have so many follow-up questions about the Pascal Siakam stuff specifically, but one of the things we also talked about last year when you shift to the other end of the floor was Indy's half-court offense. And even before the Siakam trade, I think they were second in half-court efficiency. That was per clean the glass before the Siakam trade. And so they were 24th the year before. Again, independent of the Siakam trade, what went into just that stark of a rankings improvement for them?
Yeah, I mean, the versatility by which they can score now, and I know you just told me to ignore the Pascal Siakam of it all, but like it's hard to, because it's difficult to find a pick and roll coverage that will work against them, because if you play in drop and Tyrese is Tyrese, as Samson pointed out on my podcast, he's going to plant his crops. It's going to be the agrarian economy of buckets if you play drop coverage against Tyrese and that situation. If you go to blitz, then Myles has become pretty good at knocking down that free throw line area jumper out of the short roll. And if you try to switch, then they're just going to use Siakam as the switcher, as the screener, and then he's going to punish the mismatch inside. So there's become a lot of variety by which they can score. But even before that, and a way that I think Siakam reflects it, is that they didn't really change that much after they acquired him. Like, offensively, not a lot changed. And they even talked about this. Like, I wrote an article about all of the post-entry passes that Pascal had caught from the Pacers last season, and how intriguing it was that a lot of them were coming from the top of the key rather than the wing entry that he was more so seeing with the Raptors. And part of the reasons why that was possible is because Myles is at the top of the key. You're setting in, an empty side ball screen with Pascal to get that switch. You reverse the ball to Myles. Then on the backside, they'll have, a flare and a lift to remove that low man. And if it isn't a switch, they have an automatically built-in counter that, we're going to flow into a stagger. It's one action into the next. And a lot of times people think about the Pacers playing fast in terms of how quickly they get up and down the floor, but they also transition very quickly with it between actions in the half court as well. So I think that kind of Siakam coming over and just so organically fitting in the ways that he did. And I think that there's times where they probably, could be more cognizant of him as that first initial domino. And hopefully that happens with a full training camp and more so what we're seeing. But that's one thing that I would point to, that like with the coaching staff, when I'm talking about like they may not necessarily have top 10 offensive talent overall, and yet look at what they're getting. There's little things like just in that one specific play where you can see like how foolproof that is against multiple coverages. The ball handlers that they have, I think that they probably, in my opinion, have the most depth at the point guard position of any team in the NBA, who are able to make really quick reads based on what they're seeing on the floor. And they really do. I mean, it's become a cliche, but they aim to play random as much as possible, and they have a lot of players who are capable of doing that.
What did you make of the Siakam Haliburton dynamic, like just during that initial period before they've gone through a training camp together? Because it felt at times, I don't know if this was, the fact that Haliburton missed some time, he was banged up, and they also have him off the ball more once Buddy Hield leaves. It felt like they were leading separate existences to me at points when I was watching them. But what did you make of that dynamic, and what would you like to see, or how would you expect it to grow leading into next season?
I think that's a good way to put it. I think there was times where they were kind of existing in separate spheres. If you look at the numbers, like I think I anticipated seeing a lot more of potentially Tyrese being used as an inverted screener for Siakam than what you saw earlier on. But then when you started watching the matchups, it's like, oh, this is actually kind of tricky to get to because they're both being guarded by the opposing team's best players. And then if you get that switch, it's not necessarily an advantage. So when you're talking about them kind of existing in separate spaces, it became a place where it's like, okay, enter the ball to Pascal at the elbow and put Tyrese at the weak side wing, put Myles in the ball side corner, put a guard in the dunker spot, and it kind of became inverted spacing there, something that you see the Thunder do a lot, something that you see Boston do a lot, where they put those guards in the dunker so it's a much smaller person as a rim protector, a person who's not usually in position to have to be bluffing to protect the rim and both stay at the dunker spot. So that's something that they went to, but I think I would like to see them go to the inverted looks a little bit more, and they did in the playoffs. One of my favorite playoff moments was against the Knicks when Tyrese was being hounded to the degree that he was by Deuce McBride, and he ends up being top locked. And he tried to go set an inverted reverse angle screen at the elbow for Siakam, which Siakam then rejected and got to the rim. It was just a lot of high caliber problem solving for them, to be reading those things in the moment and know what adjustment Tyrese needed to make, given how much teams were also forcing him to the sidelines in those particular games to prevent him from being able to get to his right, and the angle that they popped Siakam at to get to that as well. So I think that there's still room for them to grow with that, and hopefully that's something that'll happen coming out of training camp. And I will say on the side note of that is that's also why Nembhard and Siakam might be really good pick and roll partners to a degree, because Nembhard's not going to be guarded by the top assignment. He's going to be getting the weaker assignment. So if he goes and screens for Siakam, Siakam's going to be getting a more favorable matchup, but a lot of that's going to be dependent on if Nembhard can have the same degree of gravity that Tyrese does when he leaks out of that, that slot screen and goes to the perimeter. So that's something to monitor, because I don't think those numbers shook out very well for the Pacers quite yet, but Nembhard obviously did make strides with his shot during the playoff run. So
you have already mentioned Pascal Siakam's defensive role, and one of the pieces you wrote this offseason, which was great, obviously, was about his defensive role and how they use him in all these different ways, to a point where it felt like, just reading it inconsistently. What do you view? And I know you just mentioned about, is his ideal role, okay, he's guarding the big and then switching ball screens? Is it you want to tether him to a primary wing assignment? What do you view as his ideal defensive role if you were running things? And also, do we ever expect him to have maybe more of a, I don't know the way to phrase this, like a stable offensive identity, or is kind of just moving him around and changing the way he's used just going to be the stasis?
Defensively, it's interesting because as well, and like what I just described about the post-entry passes with Siakam, and in part why that's possible, because Myles, if he stands outside the three-point line, typically the bigs at least going to have their feet outside the free throw line to kind of make that high-low post-entry pass possible, as well as they fit. And as much as it makes sense that Siakam said, after Kevin Durant, Myles is one of the players that he wanted to play with most, it's a little bit trickier defensively, because Myles is a player that you don't want to switch with, and Siakam's a player who needs to switch. So there's times in 4 or 5 screening actions where Siakam's just running into contact. He's a big body. He's a big target. I don't think it's necessarily reasonable to expect him to get over those screens, and he really wasn't. So, you could watch games, one that's very telling is they played the Pelicans after the trade deadline, in which they put Siakam on Jonas Valanciunas to start that game. Myles Turner was guarding Zion Williamson, and Aaron Nesmith was guarding Brandon Ingram. And when the screener approaches being Valanciunas, Aaron's chasing over the top because they don't want to switch it, because they don't want Aaron to have a mismatch with Aaron Nesmith, or to potentially be getting scrammed and running out to the corner into a mismatch with Zion Williamson. So then you kind of have Siakam and drop, which isn't his best coverage. And I understand where that line of thought's coming from, because I really do think that Myles at this stage in his career is better as a potential big that you keep low around the rim and as a weak side rim protector rather than a ball side anchor. But the problem is you have to have the right four to do that. And while Siakam, I do think, is capable of guarding a screener and switching out to the ball, they don't have that wing defender. Again, like I mentioned, that if you had done that with Aaron Nesmith, then he's going to be running to a mismatch with Zion under the basket. And also just the fact that I do think that quietly teams have started getting better at adjusting for the roaming big. They'll just use Myles as defender as the screener anyways, and he's still going to be in pick and roll action. So I don't necessarily know if that's a foolproof solution. Of the things that I've seen from Siakam, what I liked from him the most is I did think he was effective using his lateral size in that series against the Knicks when, he was roaming off of Achua, Josh Hart, and just having that shadow presence. I think a lot of people talked about making the switch between Nembhard and Nesmith on ball, and that did make a difference because Nesmith had more length on Brunson, but he was able to press up and use his length against Brunson more because Siakam was back in the shadows. And he, again, is okay and contained when he switches out to the ball, but there was a lot of other roles for him where I think some of it comes from a very dramatic scheme change coming from playing from Nick Nurse and even under Darko Rajakovic, and then coming to what the Pacers were attempting to do. And also just him reaching the point in his career where he's not necessarily an emphatic secondary rim protector anymore. Sometimes when he's faced with speed on the perimeter, he can't quite stay in front. And again, there was just a lot of games where it was I understand why in game 4 he wasn't guarding Jaylen Brown anymore. So that's kind of the spot that they find themselves in.
Do you think when they got him, they did so understanding that they were still going to then need to go out and get that other wing player? Or do you think the hope was that he would be able to handle more of those situations in higher volume?
I think some of it depends on the wing too, because late in the game against Phoenix, both teams ended up countering, and Nurkic and Myles Turner were not on the floor anymore. Kevin Durant was at the 5, and Siakam managed there because Kevin Durant, is more of a player who's going to attack with his jump shot and from mid range, and there Siakam can use his length and stay in front. So there are certain ones. Jaylen Brown's speed bothered him. It also didn't help that sometimes they were trying to execute incongruent pick and roll coverages against Jaylen Brown in that series between him and Tyrese Haliburton at the same time. But I think that they might have, because to be honest, like I watched a lot of Raptors because I do a lot of Raptors crossover content. And I thought in part, there's a soul tax to be played here. Like OG Anunoby.
Yes, one of my favorite Caitlin Cooper phrases, soul tax.
Yeah, because like OG Anunoby wasn't defending great either before he got traded to the Knicks. Like lo and behold, he goes to the Knicks and he makes that entire roster make sense defensively. Like everybody's in a more natural role. So they might have thought, Pascal might bounce back a little bit here. And there were times where he did. But I think that they still overall, like even if they thought this is the defense they were going to get from Siakam, you still make that trade, especially with what they gave up. Jordan Moore is not in the league anymore. Bruce Brown kind of underperformed for the Pacers quietly before he was even traded to Toronto, where he also underperformed for reasons that I don't know how much he really wanted to be in Toronto after he got traded there. I'll just leave that there. But and the middling first that they also gave up with them. So he answered so many other things that they needed that were reflected in that in-season tournament loss that I think that they're still, it doesn't color my opinion of the trade and that it was a home run for them to do it at the asking price. It's just that, now that they've seen it, I would expect that they still think that they have more work to do to build out the defensive foundation that they have.
Only tangentially related, I've been using your soul tax thing to describe Tobias Harris in Detroit because of like everyone was so down on him in Philly. And I was like, Caitlin uses this term soul tax. I feel like Tobias Harris might be first team all soul tax based off how like the past 2 years went.
The change in expectations could be good for him. You don't know. Like going from where there's championship expectations and he's always disappointing to going to a place where he needs to be a floor raiser and a veteran presence. We might look at him differently in a year.
So Tyrese Haliburton, what do you make of a season in which he looks like a top 5 MVP lock for a huge chunk of the year, gets injured, comes back, struggles. Then you also go through the Buddy Hield trade in addition to the Pascal Siakam arrival. And then Tyrese Haliburton, it felt like after the Buddy Hield exit, like he was being used completely differently. Right. Again, what do you just kind of take away from Haliburton's season? And like, what does the next frontier, now that he's going to go through a full training camp and this is sort of the roster it's set for now? What is the next frontier for him then?
Right. I mean, you said what's the biggest storyline you'll be monitoring. And I feel like Tyrese is probably the biggest story that like most national media is going to be monitoring because there was that massive swing. I mean, as you mentioned, when he started the season, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but his conversion rate on pull-up threes was to begin the year and on the volume he was doing it at was very similar to Steph Curry's MVP run in 2016. I don't know if he's going to be able to maintain those types of numbers for a full season, but I think he is closer to being the player that we saw at the beginning of the year than what we were seeing post-hamstring injury, especially when he tried to come back and then ended up being out a little bit longer after playing that first game with Siakam in Portland. And as you mentioned, like the Buddy Hield thing, like I want to be clear because I think people confuse what I meant about Buddy at times. I do not think that Buddy Hield made Tyrese Haliburton. Tyrese Haliburton is a star in and of himself. That being said, when you're somebody who's going through a hamstring injury and you are very notably struggling to gain separation on the perimeter, and the number one thing that the Pacers do is they ranked 30th in isolations before acquiring Pascal Siakam, 30th in isolations per 100 possessions. They don't do
That's
it very
criminal
often.
When you have TJ McConnell on the roster. How are you not isoing all the time?
Exactly, right? So, I mean, when Tyrese would get a switch against a big on the perimeter, the number one thing that they would do is have Buddy go, blur, go set a ghost screen to try to create a little bit of hesitation to gain traction for Tyrese. And I was tracking it at the time when he was really going through that three-point shooting slump, and I was like, well, look at it. When he's having to do self-created threes, he's more often going to his step back to his left, which is not Tyrese's normal pattern. Tyrese prefers to step back to his right, but he wasn't getting to that shot as often, in part because people were shading him to his left more often, but also because he couldn't power off of that left leg with the hamstring injury as much anymore. And it was affecting what type of shots he got, and also because he became the best movement shooter in the starting lineup. Things that Buddy was doing, Tyrese was now doing. He was the person running, off of floppy actions under the basket, or he was becoming the ghost screener, or he was setting not on incredibly high volume, but he was the best person to set an inverted screen and leak out to the perimeter because he has the most gravity. So, I mean, you saw he was doing more as the off-ball cutter. He was receiving less picks as the pick-and-roll ball handler. Defensive coverages were changing against him. So I think that when he's healthy again, you're going to see a little bit of a restoration back towards what that role was, and hopefully they can find other players that they can plug in and, provide a reasonable facsimile for some of what Buddy was doing. Because those guys, Tyrese had played with him for his whole career. That was a reality. Like, I know people like to think that I was like, Isaac Newton and somehow like an apple hit me on the head and I just made up the concept of gravity. But it really was a thing in terms of what ways that Tyrese was operating in the offense. Like, numerically, you can look at it and see, he's setting way more screens. He's being used as the cutter way more often, and he's getting like 10 ball screens less per 100 possessions since Buddy was traded. Like, there was going to be an adjustment period, even though, like I said, I don't think Buddy made him. It was just going to be a change from there. So when you ask about like what I'm looking at going forward, it's the most important thing for Tyrese is going to be durability and being able to stay healthy. And there was some reporting that he had kind of had some type of an injury over the back 2 games with Team USA. So we'll see how he is in training camp. That's top notch. And then obviously, defensively, like I mentioned prior to, can he take a bump and still be able to get over the top of the screen, not be bullied quite as much, potentially like, was a little bit damaging at times in the Eastern Conference Finals when he was having to guard Drew because he is giving up some heft there in those types of matchups where Drew is going to some bully ball possessions. And then also, like, this is a very niche thing, but because he gets forced left so often, there was one game last year where he made a lefty floater. And I actually think that if he could develop an offhand floater, that would be huge for him. Like, he went to it deliberately because, one of the things with Tyrese is so much of his game's built on range and touch that there's additive incentive to weak him because you're already sitting on his dominant hand when he goes to stop and pop in the lane with the right. If you're sitting on that right hip and he can go to it with his offhand and get to it, that would be a really big counter for him. So that was like a really quiet thing that he did against one of the games they played against the Pistons, I believe. But continuing to see that accuracy there. And just being willing to see more friction overall.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you there. I was going to say, you kind of just made me wonder who is the best offhand floater in the NBA at the moment, and I don't even have an answer for it.
Mike Conley deliberately goes, like, he uses it in his dominant hand.
What stood out to you the most about Andrew Nembhard's season last year, where like there was an actualization of all the flashes or hints of stuff that he had showed during his first year in Indiana?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that quietly stood out is that he had a really solid summer league a year ago. He was just really moseying to his spots, playing with a lot of composure. I felt really confident about him headed into the season, but then you looked at the roster and it's like, where's the role going to necessarily come from? Because they signed Bruce Brown, and it was almost like he was going to have a smaller role because TJ McConnell's the backup point guard. As it turns out, the first game of the year, Nembhard's the backup point guard. TJ ends up clawing his way back into the rotation. When they played in the in-season tournament, when you look at those minutes, like he played 4 minutes against Boston in the in-season tournament. He came in late against the Bucks when they were in Vegas and kind of was a little bit of a zone buster, made some plays defensively, but he wasn't like TJ had usurped him for a time. And some of it was just the dynamic of at a certain point in time, it's like Andrew's doing the Bruce Brown things better than Bruce Brown, but also he just had to overcome the fact that he literally pretty much missed the entirety of training camp because he had to have that kidney stone. And then he got slowed down by other injuries where he wasn't being able to have off-day training days where his handle, like one of the reasons I could tell he wasn't 100% was because he wasn't going to his inside hand throw-ahead dribble or the throw-ahead dribble that he would use in transition. It just didn't seem like he had the same flexibility. When you get into the playoffs, he was getting to some more of those dribble combination moves. It was tighter. And then obviously the shot development. He had worked with Jenny Busick a lot on that over the summer a year ago. And it wasn't coming around for him until, he makes that game winner. He made, I believe, 5 self-created threes the entirety of the season, and then he makes that one. Wasn't exactly, picturesque in its execution, given that he kind of mishandled the ball twice before he made it. But, hitting 50% on catch-and-shoot threes is really big for him. He was already a wonderful passer. Just him being more aggressive and looking for his shot. People are probably thinking I'm droning on here, but, when you watch him play early against the Celtics in the season in November when they gave up, historic scoring outing to the Celtics in that game. He had a hand, very few, I want to say less than 5 potential assists. There was times guys were ducking under. He was immediately getting off the ball without looking at the rim. Similar coverage in the Eastern Conference Finals, and he's actually, using a bump to still get to his spot against that under. He's looking at the rim, looking for, there was one game where the Pacers made 5 threes and he made 4 of them. So, it was just a lot of night and day stuff there. So we'll see how the shot holds up. He put the work in for it to be there. I don't think he's going to hit 50 on catch and shoot threes, but the development from him overall, all 3-point guards attack very differently from the Pacers, and all of them have their place. And certainly, Nembhard meshes really well with Tyrese because of that. It was very evident in the playoffs that it was helpful to have a secondary ball handler out there that could be initiating against Damian Lillard, against Jalen Brunson, to be putting them into action, with Tyrese, sometimes doing some things off ball, and then also having Andrew obviously be able to defend at the point of attack, which is something that dual dynamic isn't something that anybody else does to his degree on the roster.
From my million-foot view, last season and entering last season, I just viewed Andrew Nembhard as just this defensive specialist, and then to see where he is by the end of the year, just so comfortable getting off his self-created jumpers, was just it felt like a completely different player, where it's I just trust his offense more than I trust his defense at that point. And had you told me that that's how I would feel last September, I wouldn't have been able to fathom it. And so it's just
in the playoffs, the Pacers.
Playoffs,
the Pacers scored more points per chance with Nembhard as the pick and roll ball handler very quietly than they did with Tyrese or with TJ. And that in part, again, I'm talking about when you're being guarded by Damian Lillard and Jalen Brunson, that certainly helps. But also, it certainly helps when you have somebody that can be putting those guys through pick and roll actions and still be making the correct reads for them to be able to do that. So, I will say I was one of the higher people on Andrew Nembhard. I did the preview pod with Nate Duncan, and they're like, what guys are you looking at? And I was like, Andrew Nembhard had a really good summer. So
you mentioned before about Tyrese Haliburton and some of his production or role restoration coming to the season. Does that mean then we're going to see, is that something Andrew Nembhard can replicate, where you're talking about all the stuff that Tyrese Haliburton was doing away from the ball? Do you view Andrew Nembhard as someone who can replicate then some of that volume, or is he more comfortable being the guy who's operating on the ball in those situations?
Yeah, there was one possession that I was nervous about. They were up in Toronto, and Andrew was kind of playing in the buddy role, standing at the weak side wing when Tyrese came off a pick. And all season long, Tyrese doesn't often see next coverage, where that player at the wing will literally, hop onto the ball on a pick and roll coverage with Tyrese's defender peeling off to Andrew at the wing. And it really surprised Tyrese, because when you're playing with Buddy, people face guard him and will stay clear at the 3-point line. It wasn't something that he normally saw. He got caught off guard, ended up getting his shot blocked on a pull-up 2, despite the fact that Tyrese shoots pull-up 2s as jump shots, whereas he shoots 3s as set shots. And I think it ended up being a turnover after the Raptors collected the ball. And I was like, ooh, we'll see how that plays out and what the gravity's like. If Nembhard's shot holds up, people aren't going to be willing to do, potentially those types of things, especially because, something that I kind of pointed out as an oddity about Nembhard is how far he stands off the 3-point line. And at times, he'll catch a grenade and he'll be at 30 feet. And it's okay, you haven't made any shots from that depth, but and it allows him to attack a longer closeout. And it sure paid a dividend when he made, the game winner from that depth in the playoffs. Egg on my face with that one. But he doesn't take a lot of movement threes. I will say that. There was a point in the game against Canada where I had looked up a number, because against zone, he had actually moved into the corner from the baseline and made a 3. And I was like, I don't know if I saw him do that all season for the Pacers. So the movement shooting aspect of it, he's not going to be on the same level as Tyrese at in order to just flip-flop them. But in terms of having Tyrese being able to do more out of the pick and roll and Andrew being, a reliable catch and shoot shooter, I think that's possible, in addition to Nembhard continuing to get, similar volume of ball screens. Is still considerably less than what Tyrese gets, and being able to have his own opportunity to run the offense too at times. I think a lot of it's just going to depend on what type of coverage they're seeing, to be quite honest.
What did you make of Bennedict Mathurin's season pre-shoulder injury, and what is now his pathway to fitting in on a team that has this version of Andrew Nembhard in addition to Tyrese Haliburton, not to mention Pascal Siakam, who needs the ball, and then, of course, TJ McConnell also getting his extension?
Yeah, I want to be clear. I don't speak for the Pacers here. This isn't something that they've said publicly or to anybody, but if it were me after the playoffs, I would feel like I have 3 rock-solid starters, and Tyrese, Nembhard, and Pascal Siakam. I have a little bit more question marks at the other 2 spots. Clearly, Myles Turner on this roster, given the personnel that are there. There's nobody, there's not an in-house replacement for Myles Turner. Myles did a lot of good things for them offensively. We might touch on him later, but like with regards to Ben, I think that there's a tendency to turn Andrew Nembhard and Bennedict Mathurin weirdly into the next Turner and Sabonis and make this contentious. I don't really see as though that's the spot that Ben would necessarily be coming for, because we just saw the things that happened to Tyrese in the playoffs, the exaggerated coverages that he saw, and the way that Andrew Nembhard answered some of those. For Ben, if he's going to leapfrog over somebody, I would more so see it being Aaron Nesmith and Ben becoming the starter there. Because as many good things as Aaron does, you get into a place in the playoffs where, over 85% of Aaron's shots were zero dribble threes, or of his threes were zero dribble threes. He's not somebody who can really recapture his own rhythm with a one dribble sidestep three. And then he did make several pull-up twos in Game 7 against the Knicks, but, he made like 20 of those total in the regular season. Like, if you run him aggressively off the line, he doesn't necessarily have a counter. Ben, to his credit, has the crystallized skill in that there are shots that he can get to that nobody on the roster can get to. So the question for Ben becomes, can he make enough strides defensively to warrant you not playing Aaron Nesmith? I have some questions about that to this current point in time, because in games when they needed to do that, like they started Ben, Andrew, and Tyrese against the Dallas Mavericks, that was a game that they won. But you could see early on, like, not necessarily ideal to be having Ben guarding Luka or Kyrie Irving in the same way that you would feel more comfortable with it being, Andrew and Aaron Nesmith. So Ben, a lot of it defensively, point of attack wise, like his screen navigation is still pretty rough. He veers way too early. Like you look at the numbers, if it's Ben Sheppard at the point of attack with Myles Turner, they allow like 0.8 points per chance. When it's Bennedict Mathurin, it's like 1.121. Like it's a dramatic swing for Myles Turner when it's Ben at the point of attack having to actually guard over screens. But Ben is okay in certain situations. He's better on ball than he is off ball. And that's where the awareness things happen, because I genuinely, projecting feel and projecting awareness, particularly on the defensive end, is a very tough thing to do. It's possible that Ben could come back and things really click for him. And he does have the athleticism. He has the tenacity that you could be like, hey, look, there is a defender in there. But if he continues to have some of the coverage lapses, some of, can't be getting cut by Max Strus 2 times on the same possession, and then some of the point of attack stuff that you already need to relieve from Tyrese Haliburton, it becomes trickier. And then also, like, the impact numbers weren't great for Ben on the year, and Ben's usage swings wildly when he plays with Tyrese versus when he doesn't. It's like 26% without Tyrese and like 20 to below with Tyrese. So in some ways, I think it's just more natural for him to be that 6-man scorer, getting to play with either TJ or Ben Sheppard, who can defend at the point of attack, where you can funnel more offense into the hands of Ben. And more importantly, you can run more plays for Ben, because Ben plays much better out of plays than he does reads currently. And that's another thing. Like, he needs to make quicker decisions. He needs to find the passing avenues when he gets to the rim, because the league is being called differently. He doesn't get the same calls that he got as a rookie when he gets to the rim and he draws that physicality. That didn't happen last season. And teams know we can load up on him at the rim, because he literally had the lowest pass out rate on drives of any guard in the NBA last year. It was like 20-something%. So those types of things. And I want to be clear, like, I think people think sometimes I'm too hard on Ben. Again, he was the best isolation scorer, and he doesn't get as tough as assignments as Pascal, as Tyrese does. But overall, like, just on a points per possession standpoint, he was the best isolation scorer on the team. He can shoot over double teams in Toronto. There's some incredible shot making there, and I can definitely look at spots in the playoffs and be like, that's a spot where Bennedict Mathurin would have helped them. But in terms of him, like, taking the next step and entering into the starting lineup, that's going to have to be a prove it thing. Like, I don't think it's going to be the same as last year when he and Obi Toppin kind of were christened as the early season starters, and then it was like it was theirs to lose, which eventually did happen. I think this case it's going to have to be for Ben, like, what he does at training camp, what he does in preseason, the early season, for him to actually earn that spot. Otherwise, I would expect them to stick with the same starting lineup as last year.
I guess they'll run into this issue with Jarace Walker as well, but when you're juggling the expectations of progress isn't linear, so even throwing out the Eastern Conference Finals appearance, this is a team that's trying to win. How much of like a runway are they going to be prepared to give Bennedict Mathurin when the thing that they probably need the most is not what he does best? And then I don't mean to make this a Mathurin or Sheppard thing, but like when you have Sheppard, who defends like he has an emotional attachment to the outcome of every single defensive possession, like, is there just a chance that for what the Pacers are trying to do this season, that Sheppard winds up being like a better option or more valuable or just more important to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, like, I don't want to be too hard on Ben, because I do think that Ben exists somewhat in liminal space. I like to compare him to a trapeze artist. I do think that there were times where he was trying to make the correct read. It just wasn't always the correct read. Like, he let go of the rung behind him. He just hasn't quite grasped on to the next one quite yet. So that's why it's difficult to say. And like you just said, like, Ben Sheppard was a part of the Amian rotation. I don't think it's necessarily going to be a case of Ben versus Ben either, because I'm pretty confident that they would play Mathurin off the bench for that scoring punch. But if they're willing to go 10, which there's reasons to think playing 10 is hard in the NBA, but there's reason to think that this Pacer team in particular, if a team can do it, it's them, because they really try to manage minutes. Number one, that's something that Pascal's agent talked about, that Pascal liked, that, he wasn't playing for Nick Nurse. He didn't say Nick Nurse, but, he wasn't playing the heavy minute load anymore, that they do monitor that. The Pacers play a ton of press defense. They play very fast. That behooves playing deeper into the roster. It's more going to be like, I think, the 10th man decision between Ben Sheppard and Jarace Walker. And when you come to that, like, Ben Sheppard, despite the fact that he's not really going to be a player who shines in Summer League because of what he does offensively, defensively, he was making a lot of plays already where, like, if it was just based on defensive merit right now, right here today, without seeing whatever other progress has been made, I would still say that Ben's ahead of Jarace defensively in terms of being able to plug him into this team right here, right now.
I'm fascinated by Ben Sheppard. There was a summer league play that stood out to me in 2023. I told you in the outline, the play where he is denying an entry pass from Brook Lopez, then steals it in the series against the Bucks. That just lives rent free in my head for some reason. What is the 90th percentile outcome for a player like that? Because the energy that he gives you on defense, but there's also some discipline mixed in, and he's the type of player, for me anyway, you watch him and you feel him. It's like, what does that do for this Pacers team, or what does that mean to the Pacers going forward?
Yeah, defensively, he and Nembhard are at the top in terms of point of attack defenders, and then Ben Sheppard is very good at both holding his ground and covering a lot of ground. On a closeout, he can cover a long closeout with his quick feet more so than other people can, and then he can hold his spot on a veer switch and will actually get in, run the seam, and box that guy out, or be able to front and really scrape and claw. He projects his presence bigger than he is defensively, and I'm sure he'll continue to add strength to his frame as he goes, given that he was a rookie last year. But for him, I think more so it speaks to, I don't know how you are, but there's two archetypes of players in the playoffs that I think really work. And one of them is a two guard who can run offense, hence Andrew Nembhard. And the other one is a movement shooter who can guard ones, a Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, a Danny Green. And I think that Danny Green's kind of what you're hoping for with Ben Sheppard, like that model, because Ben isn't going to be a frequent driver. You're always going to kind of cringe when Danny Green had to take more than about 2 dribbles. But can Ben Sheppard be the movement shooter that he was projected to be coming out of Belmont? He only made 1 3 in the series against Boston when he was playing more minutes. Can he start making threes? And also, will he start taking them? Because this is an interesting juxtaposition between Ben Sheppard and Bennedict Mathurin. Ben Sheppard's very easy to plug into a scheme. He's going to keep the ball moving. He's going to continue advantages. He's going to crash really hard on offensive rebounds. That has, he doesn't always come up with the rebound, but it does have effects on their defense headed the other way and things that they want to do there. But there is a stat that I think is pretty telling, in that he almost had more passes out of the corners than shots from the corners. So wow. He'll catch a skip pass, and the Pacers very much want to trigger the extra pass out of skip passes, but he doesn't always, read that X out rotation and know when he should put up a shot. He's so intent on playing within the team scheme and playing for his teammates that he doesn't always rightfully look for his own shot. Whereas Ben, is going to drive into a crowd come, hell or high water, and he doesn't always see those passing avenues. So each of them provide a little bit different thing, and definitely you have a place for both. But I think at my high end, if you got to where Ben Sheppard wanted to be, he'd be that type of a player that it's like, yeah, that's a role player I want in my rotation, because potentially maybe, he could be that facsimile eventually of, being somebody who could ghost to switch, also be able to defend at the point of attack and just do a lot of little other quiet things. Rick Carlisle said of him that he starred in his role for them during the playoffs. Always a big proponent of Ben Sheppard whenever you hear him talk about him.
I was listening to something earlier this summer. You were on Locked On Pacers with Tony East, and I think you said that the Pacers have a Jarace Walker-sized hole on the defensive end. Can Jarace Walker be, based off what you've seen or what you project forward, what this team needs defensively?
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of criticism that he wasn't in the rotation to the degree that he was, and I think that they were trying to teach better habits. And then through no fault of his own, they traded for Obi Toppin, they traded for Pascal Siakam, and now they're trying to make a position change for him where he's going to play more at the 3. And much to Walker's credit, he had a hitch in his shot at Summer League a year ago. I think some of that had to do with the elbow, and then also he was leaning to his left on his release on like almost every shot. His 3-point shot really turned around in the G League. You could see that mechanically he had made strides there very quickly, and the 3 fell for him at Summer League this year as well. So that makes it more feasible to be playing him at the 3 where there might be more opportunities for him. I do think it was very telling this summer, though, that Gennaro Pargo talked about it. Rick Carlisle talked about it publicly on the radio that they were going to be looking for Jarace, high motor, rebounding, being able to take on a defensive matchup, conditioning. It wasn't going to be about, how many points he scored or how many fancy plays he made. It was going to be looking about stuff there. And that, you're also seeing like Pascal Siakam, and I'm not saying there was intent behind this from Pascal, but Pascal working with him at his home in Orlando and kind of recording and talking about like, to all the young players, if you get sent down to the G League, show them why you don't believe in the G League. If you're playing in garbage time, you got to play hard during garbage time to prove why you should be in there during regular time. Because if you're not doing it then, how are they going to trust you, in the late game situation for you to be out there? And to hear Rick talk about it, that there was kind of an expectation from Jarace that, he was going to play. And the fact that those things were being said publicly kind of raised my antenna a little bit, because when you're willing to go on the record with some of those things on the radio, and then some of them are still showing up in Summer League, when Jarace is on the margin of the rotation, like he had good rebounding numbers in Game 5, but also some of the same stuff was showing up where, he's ducking under a total action. There's one play where in transition, he's reaching, he's doing stuff with his hands more than sliding laterally. And then tellingly on the very next possession, he's picking up full court and actually changing the direction of the ball a few times. So his body of work to this point hasn't necessarily reflected his body size. There was also some interesting like matchup stuff going on where like he was picking up Rob Dillingham at the point of attack where Ben Sheppard was the low man, kind of like testing his ability to be sticking with guards and seeing how he would handle switching. I think he's kind of like Pascal. He's better at switching out to the ball in late clock situations than potentially chasing over screens. He's a bigger body too, but I think he's going to have more proof of product to show in preseason to think that, like I said, that he would automatically be pushing Ben Sheppard out of the rotation, despite the fact that like he is a player that if he could dial up, like I don't want to necessarily say the word effort, but for lack of better terms, the high motor, the conditioning aspect of it that could potentially, rectify some of their problems out there, but where necessarily are the minutes going to come from is the thing for him.
Should there be a concern at all about what he becomes or is able to do offensively if they kind of view him as the de facto 3? We already mentioned just the improved jump shot, and he took on a permanent basis way more threes than I would have thought as a rookie. I know he didn't play a ton, but almost 6 per 36. I would have smashed the under on that if he gave me that. But like if you're going to be in that role, some of the stuff that he does best, like the passing, if the ball is not going to be in his hands, how valuable is that? Is there a way for them to unlock any of that when he's playing the 3, or to even help unlock more rim pressure because he did not get to the basket a ton last year? Like, what does that, like, again, just the initial question of just like, is there any concern about what does he become offensively if he is viewed as, I don't even want to call him a 3, but more of a wing who's going to play in a lot of lineups where there are maybe 2 or 3 ball handlers in front of him in the pecking order?
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like Summer League, there was probably too much point Jarace for my liking, and in part that had to do with the construction of the roster. Quentin Jackson's like a dynamic slashing guard, and Tristan Newton really had to adapt from UConn's playbook to playing the more, processing on the fly style that the Pacers made. That put the ball in the hands of Jarace more often. They just didn't have a lot of lead playmakers on that roster. His handle wasn't really taking him anywhere, and at times when he was running like high pick and rolls, he wasn't necessarily making the right reads with the tag defender. I think he did end up finishing with more turnovers than assists. He got to the ratio of shots at the rim versus the runners was better in Summer League than what it was in the half court with the G League and with the Pacers. So he didn't finish particularly well on layups when he got there, but he was getting there more often, which is something. And I know that Pascal was kind of working with him on certain moves to be making in the post, so he's not relying on the fadeaways quite as much. And I think that's something that would matter. But overall, to his role, I feel better about him playing the wing, like you said, than I would have a year ago, but I didn't get to see him do that many wing things. Like some of the stuff, like that's why I think preseason's still going to be really valuable for him, because I want to see him do some of that with Tyrese or Andrew or TJ on the floor, where like you can put him at the wing, you can run a pick and roll, between, Tyrese and Myles, and maybe if Tyrese is getting blitzed, you can throw it to Jarace, and he has excellent soft touch. He can throw offhand floaters where he can short the roll and enter that pass to the big, and being that type of a connective passer in that way rather than having to be a lead initiator. I don't know what it is because, the roster in the G League wasn't really set up for him to necessarily have that role or even to be playing at the 4 all the time either. He had to do a lot of ball handling there too. And it's almost like he plays with more pep in his step when he gets to do it. So sometimes I wonder if they're at Summer League allowing him to do some of that to try to, potentially coax some of the other stuff that they want to see, for lack of better terms. But I would like to see less of the pick and roll ball handling, especially given the roster construction that they have, and just get to observe him more in Summer League, see what progress the defense continues to make. He did a 3-week training regimen with Jim Boylan headed into Summer League, and he continued to make conditioning progress. And one other thing that I will say is, much like Pascal, the scheme that Jarace played in Houston was a really big adjustment with pre-rotations, very aggressive ball screen coverages, versus playing with the Pacers where they aim to not be overzealous with the low man at all. They were staying home a lot more often, and what that was calling for him to do. So as he continues to have another full training camp, we'll see where he's at the end of preseason. I'm not entirely sure where his role is going to be coming out of Summer League. I think I needed to see more defensively for me to pencil him in as a guaranteed, 10th man right off the bat.
Any early impressions or strong thoughts on Johnny Furphy?
Johnny Furphy is somebody that, kind of the theme I felt like for the Pacers this offseason is, continuity for one, but they also continue to build out their strengths necessarily than addressing their weaknesses. There was times where he held up better defensively when he got targeted in the game against Denver late than I expected him to. He uses his length okay. That being said, there was times where he was giving up mismatches under the rim, and they just didn't have the ball handlers to enter it there, where he was really getting buried. And, he's a teenager. So adding strength to his frame is going to be something. And I think it kind of behooves the Pacers because there was clear ways that he would fit into their offense. His athleticism. Obi was the first player in team history to make 100 threes and have 100 completed dunks in the same season. If Johnny Furphy is somebody that his athleticism off 2 feet and what they were running lob sets for him, and also just, more of his threes, not really above the break. A lot of them were standstill in the corners at Kansas and somewhat at Summer League. But I can see really easy ways that he can plug in and fit with what they do. I don't think the opportunities are going to be there for him this year, but that's kind of okay. Give him a year of strength training, let him get the reps in the G League and see where things are in a year. So the pick makes sense given the style of play. He's very dynamic in transition. That showed up in Summer League as well. But I don't think that there's necessarily going to be a spot for him unless there's, considerable injury stuff that they have to weather next year.
What should we expect from the I'm oddly fascinated by what the secondary frontcourt rotation is going to be for this team. Do we just pencil in, all right, it's going to be Isaiah Jackson and Obi Toppin and just soaking up those minutes, or do we see more of Obi Toppin at the 5, or maybe even more of Siakam as the lone big without Obi Toppin, to where that would allow Jarace to slide up to the 4, where maybe he might make more sense defensively or offensively? Just what do you kind of make of that, again, without having seen games from this coming season?
My expectation, given what the coaching staff said last year, is that it will be more of the same this year and that people are going to compete for spots. So, Isaiah Jackson, they had under team control. Jalen Smith did end up leaving in free agency, but at the beginning of the year, Jalen Smith had won the backup 5 position. He had, some struggles, and there was reasons why they went to Isaiah in the playoffs, but they let it be who won the minutes, and that's who they played. So I think it'll be between, Isaiah Jackson and James Wiseman during training camp, see what James Wiseman can bring to them in terms of which one of them is the backup big. And then it will likely be matchup dependent. It made a lot of sense in the Bucks series for them to not be playing Isaiah or Jalen. The Bucks were playing smaller with Danilo Gallinari and with Bobby Portis doing stuff and spread lineups. So they were just like, what, we're going to go small too, and we're going to outrun you because we're not necessarily getting a lot of stops trying to defend in space. So that's what we'll go to. Then you saw in the next round, they were playing bigger sometimes with Isaiah, Pascal, and Obi out there all at the same time. So I think I would expect it to be very fluid in terms of which way they go with whether playing big. And when I say big, I don't think they're going to play 2 centers at the same time, but big in terms of maybe Pascal or Jarace playing at the 3 and giving them more size at the 2 forward positions, or if they're willing to go really small with, Obi and Pascal out there.
Are you ready to enter the cookie cutter portion of this year's podcast?
Of course. This is the part I prepared for in advance.
What is there anything about this team that is flying under the radar, not receiving enough attention that you think needs to be discussed?
I mean, I'll use some cookie cutter cliches here, but I mean, I do think that there is something to continuity and that there's been a whole lot of wholesomeness going on around the Pacers this summer. Like the fact that that entire team showed up to watch Tyrese and Andrew Nembhard in Las Vegas, the fact that they're all gathered this many weeks in advance at Pascal's house, that there is some added motivation there because one thing that I would like to say, I don't want to relitigate the playoff run again, but the Pacers don't have as many conflicting goals to manage next season as some of the other teams in the East do. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the Pacers are going to be a better team, but it means in the regular season, like when you look at Cleveland, for instance, I know you already did the Cleveland look ahead with Justin. I feel like, Kenny Atkinson's job is really to raise the ceiling of that offense. So you may have to do some things during the regular season for the sake of the playoffs that may not lead to a night-to-night win, but might pay dividends for you later. Same with the Milwaukee Bucks. They can't get to the playoffs again and not have Damian Lillard and Giannis Antetokounmpo in the playoffs. They're going to need to manage that throughout the season. The Pacers play a very devastating style of basketball in the regular season where they pressed on more than 400 possessions in the playoffs, and that was more than any team in Synergy's 15-year database. So if you're facing full court pressure, which they seem very committed to, you're facing full court pressure. You're facing the pressure and that full court pressure that they're playing on defense feeds into their offensive identity too. You're facing them, being one of the fastest teams in the NBA in terms of average time to shoot. They're going to play deep. They're not going to play their top guys, the heavy minutes that some of the other teams do. That's a lot of things that I don't think necessarily would be considered when people are pegging how good this team could be because they're not. I think some of it's getting too conflated with the playoffs. Like when you're just looking at can they compete for home court advantage given that other teams in the East made very splashy moves, I think, is it guaranteed that they'll be a top 4 team? No, but can they compete for one of those seeds? Yeah, I definitely think so.
Yeah, their style is grating in a way too on the other team just because they're so, and it's as you mentioned before, it's not just transition. It's even if it's semi-transition or just in the half court and they're so quick that it just grades on defenses. And that's a really, I did not give that enough thought, but it does feel like it's a recipe to just win a bunch of regular season games, maybe more than you would expect, even if you don't believe that this is a top end postseason team.
Like I said, even then, the fact that I feel like they had some degree of proof of concept in that, they still had 120 offensive rating. They still maintained their identity. And that was a big thing that I was going to be watching in the playoffs. Can they still play fast? Can they still get in transition? And then pressing was a big part of how they were able to artificially maintain that in ways that, we don't always see. The cliche is the game slows down in the playoffs. Well, it didn't necessarily for the Pacers. So the fact that they were able to maintain that, the fact that they were in the positive with Tyrese and Pascal, and Tyrese really wasn't himself after that injury in the regular season, nor completely in the playoffs, minus, I felt like he was starting to get there right before he re-injured himself. I think that stuff bodes well in their favor, and I think that they're going to be highly motivated, and I think on a night-to-night basis, that's going to be a tough team to play.
I feel like I don't know if this is under the radar, especially because you mentioned it a couple of times. My under the radar question for them is, can they materially improve the defensive rebounding? Where a big part of what might boost their defense is if they could just end possessions after a missed shot.
Yeah, and that's a huge thing, right? Because I will counter and say they still rank 22nd in first chance defense. So it's kind of like the Oscar Tshiebwe conundrum. Fans last year were always like, just play Oscar. Their rebounding's terrible. It's like, okay, but you have to manufacture enough stops to actually get the rebound. And Oscar wasn't necessarily enabling you to do that, especially against spread lineups. So the defensive rebounding thing, definitely, game 5 against the New York Knicks, they gave up 20 offensive rebounds. Isaiah Hartenstein had 12 on his own. And, not exactly flattering that the Knicks played smaller, removed Precious Achiuwa, and started Deuce McBride. They had a smaller starting lineup than the Pacers did, and the Pacers still gave up that many rebounds. And kind of, one of the enduring plays that I take with me from that playoffs is right at the end of game 4. Myles is cross-matched out onto Jason Tatum. He had given up some self-created threes to Tatum. Tatum, I think, only made 10 during the entire postseason run and made 2 just in that game against the Pacers. And then also had some drives against Myles. So Aaron Nesmith's like, oh, holy crap. Myles is on an island with Jason Tatum, and he goes switch to blitz, goes and blitzes that. And as soon as he does, then Andrew Nembhard's over there, and it's a 2-on-1, on the offensive glass for the Celtics. Plus, Myles is switched out to the perimeter, which means your big isn't under there to be able to get the rebound. So they couldn't switch. And then if they have to commit 2 to the ball, they're even more vulnerable on the glass. So, this is another double-edged sword because I've talked about, I would really like to see them implement some more zone. I think zone would be to their benefit. I have a wrinkle in mind that I would like to see them use. But when you play zone, your defensive rebounding tends to get worse. So can they afford to, it's the opposite of the Oscar. If you maybe manufacture some more stops, but can you get the rebound out of that? That's something that they have to consider and balance. And that was in part why after the playoffs, like, I think a lot of the stuff that Myles could be criticized for in the past, he really, pushed back against during the regular season. And then when the playoffs happened, some of it, especially in that series against Boston, what he did against certain switches against Derek White, the fact that he had more turnovers, he led the team in turnovers, had more turnovers than 3-point attempts in a series where at times he was defended by Al Horford and drop, wasn't necessarily picking and popping, kind of inserting himself in strange places, trying to post against Jason Tatum when Tatum was guarding him at the 5 with some of those cross matches. And then the fact that they really couldn't go to the switching scheme with him at the 5, tried to go with Obi Toppin at the 5, Obi gets targeted, Myles goes back in, and then you're seeing that rebounding issue. I had more questions about him after that series than I expected to have going into it, because I just thought, Myles was, Tyrese and Myles were the most effective pick and roll combination in the NBA last year. He did more against switches. He was hitting that mid-range shot against the blitz. Defensively, he can be an effective weak side rim protector, although I do think he's shown some slippage there. And the rebounding is what the rebounding is. So that's something that they're going to have to consider as, like you said, the next year of Myles Turner being in a contract year, and given that they gave out a lot of contract extensions to several players this year. So,
yeah, look, we didn't really talk about Myles Turner, like, specifically. I know you've mentioned him a few times, but that I feel like that's going to become, it won't be under the radar, but that's going to become, we got like a year hiatus from like the Myles Turner rumors, and now it feels like they're going to fire back up again this coming season.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much they will, because, I mean, it is a special thing that this is going to be his 10th year with the same team. A lot of players don't accomplish doing that. And, like, I want to make clear for fans that I really don't think that, Kevin Pritchard and Chad Buchanan and Ted Wu were in a room, and Kelly Krauskopf, and were like, oh, well, we would like to retain TJ McConnell and Andrew Nembhard, and we didn't realize that this could potentially affect our ability to sign Myles Turner and Bennedict Mathurin later on. Like, I'm sure there's some planning in place for this, in addition to them having contracts on their books that, if they do want to do a consolidation trade at some point, they need to be able to have those. And also just continuing to evaluate Myles on this roster, because there is the tiny piece in the back of my head where I think to myself, like, you can see the numbers for Myles in the pick and roll when you look at Second Spectrum of what he was doing as a screener before Rick and Tyrese got there versus what he did as a screener when Rick and Tyrese did. And, like, that's no knock on him. Tyrese is a great pick and roll creator. So is TJ McConnell. Andrew Nembhard, very good too. But, like, can you get that boost out of another player if you have that same arsenal of creation on ball? And is it worth it weathering some of the other things? I don't know. Maybe the better answer is find players that, there isn't an upgrade for Myles on the market. There isn't, I will admit, there's not one readily on the trade market that I know of who's available. There's not one on the roster, and maybe you're just trying to better support some of what we saw prop up from Myles. And I should have pointed out, Myles was dealing with a back injury in that game 4 as well, that I'm sure limited him to an extent, but those were other things that you saw throughout that series. So I don't know that would necessarily be something that they do in season. I think with Myles and what they have there, that's something that you'd probably be looking at next summer.
I actually think, and I tell people this all the time, is that because you have the entire year to get out of the luxury tax, that I would expect them to re-sign him even if it takes them in, and they will figure it out later. Right. And I also think you look at some of you mentioned consolidation trade, definitely, or just you can now use the mid-level exception as a trade exception. Obi Toppin, I think, will still slide into someone's mid-level next year if they need to clear salary for Myles Turner. So,
exactly.
And I just think he's still too mission critical to what this team wants to do, and especially if you want to have a respectable defense. However, this team is fully healthy. This is the scenario. You have to narrow down the rotation to 10 players. What is the top 10 rotation? It does feel like they have kind of just, you could order the minutes differently, but it feels like they have 9 locks for a top 10 rotation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would expect that the starting lineup's going to start out being the same. Still Andrew, Tyrese, Aaron, Pascal, and Myles. And then depending upon, what Ben does, maybe there's room for Ben to ascend if he really makes strides there. And like I said, for me, it would be looking at Aaron's spot, not necessarily Andrew's, because of the other things that Andrew brings. But if not, then I think you're looking at the bench, TJ, Bennedict Mathurin, Obi Toppin, Isaiah Jackson is probably the big that I would lean to currently. And then you're looking at, if you're going to play 10 deep, either Ben Sheppard or Jarace Walker. And currently, I would think it would be Ben Sheppard. But again, I'm very open to seeing what Jarace does during preseason. And I hope because I do think that he can answer some of their problems and balance out some of the issues they have there that we see some progress there from him.
I know this is to some extent matchup dependent, but if you had to guess what their most used closing lineup ends up being, is it just what you expect their starting lineup to be, the version that has Aaron Nesmith in it instead of Bennedict Mathurin?
Yeah, I think they played 100. They played 167 crunch time minutes, I believe, with Tyrese after acquiring Pascal, and about 50 of them were just the starters. I think that the flex piece could be Mathurin there if Mathurin's having, a really good game. We saw them close games with him against the Milwaukee Bucks last year. He played fantastically against the Bucks during the regular season. Matchup dependent.
That game where he looked like the defensive player of the year. Is that game you're referencing?
Yeah, I mean he had some good moments there for them defensively and on the glass. He's another person that maybe you address some of the defensive rebounding. There's times where he can look like he's embodied by the spirit of Lance Stevenson when he's crashing from the wings. If a lot of times very good teams in the playoffs, you can see wing players tend to level up. Like Paul George did this for the Pacers in the playoffs. He would up his rebounding numbers. Andrew Wiggins, what he did for the Golden State Warriors. I have some hope that there is more of that within Bennedict Mathurin, and that could be something that, size for position wise, maybe he brings a little bit more of too as well in certain lineups. So I would expect it to either be the starters or somebody subbing out in place and Ben going in that group.
Is there a weirdo, funky, offbeat lineup you would like to see this team roll out?
Yeah, so mine aren't necessarily funky. It's more so what I will learn from these groupings. So it's anytime that you play two of Jarace, Pascal, and Obi with Myles Turner. They did some of that against Phoenix because it allowed them to play Obi Toppin opposite of Grayson Allen. Pascal could check Kevin Durant. Myles obviously opposite of Nurkic. There's certain matchups where that's feasible for you. Or if you want to play Jarace at the 3 with either Pascal or Obi and Myles, I really want to see, can they play bigger at the forward positions than what we've seen to this point last year? I think they were a positive 5.5, but that was only 63 minutes that they attempted to do that. The next one for me is going to continue to be the small ball with Obi and Pascal, just because it was such a small sample size and they were very dependent on outscoring opponents. They did so, but their defensive rating was 122 during those minutes during the regular season. And then lastly, Tyrese and Ben and Andrew playing together at the same time. To this point, Tyrese and Ben on the floor just as a two-man unit. They have not won those minutes in Ben's rookie or sophomore season. I still think Nembhard's kind of the overall better fit, just at the 2 next to Tyrese. But I'd like to see, those are the 2 guys that they drafted. Ben was their highest draft pick, in 3 decades at the time when they selected him. How successful can you be with all 3 of them out there at the same time? So mine are kind of more mission critical than they are funky lineups, but you always come up with the best one to do. So I'm very curious to know what you have.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a way to get 5 bigs on the court at once, maybe 4. So let's go Myles Turner, Siakam, Jarace Walker, of course. Then we'll go Johnny Furphy. And then because I care about defense, we can put Andrew Nembhard instead of Tyrese Haliburton in at the 1. And I say,
you might have to play TJ. Just because TJ is going to be able to stir the drink without necessarily having to have he makes sense of weird spacing. Only TJ could make sense of TJ spacing when TJ's off the ball. That's his unique skill. So you literally, might need the Flight of the Bumblebee master to come out there and make sense of that lineup.
The only problem with that is I feel like you would have fewer pathways to putting the ball in Jarace Walker's hands while having 3 bigs around him. If Andrew Nembhard isn't on the court.
I'm not sure that's the worst thing. I'm not sure that's the worst thing.
So honestly, I won't be picky. You could put whoever you want at the 1 as long as the 4, quote unquote. I know Jarace Walker and Furphy and even Siakam aren't traditionally huge, but give me 4 bigs at once plus whoever the fuck at the 1, and I'll be content. As we record this on September the 17th, and this is one of the rare ones that will be going up immediately the day after, Caitlin, their win total is set at 47.5. Would you take the over or the under on that?
Last year I was it was a rare instance of me being very optimistic, and I was telling most people that I talked to, I think they can get to 44 wins. Even with me being after preseason, I was I'm kind of nervous about this defense. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think they could get to 44. They exceeded even my optimistic expectations. I think that they can take the over on 47 because of the things that we were talking about. During the regular season, I think they can get there. When Tyrese, Pascal, and Myles were healthy, they posted a win rate of, 0.575. They went 19 and 14. So that's right on the bubble last year of being, in the 5-4 hole. 47 wins, 48 wins gets you at home court advantage last year. Other teams in the East did get better, presumably. in relation to themselves. But I think the Pacers can take the over there potentially if they stay healthy.
Where do you see them kind of stacking up relative to the rest of the East, where I think the discussion is mostly centered on Boston, New York, Philly, and Cleveland, and then Milwaukee is like, oh, we could see those teams finishing in any kind of order, or if you want to pencil Boston in for first place, which feels a little weird just given the Porzingis injury, Horford's old, and is this team going to be as invested in the regular season? But whatever. It feels like those 5 teams are predominantly the focus, and then Indy and Miami and Orlando are mentioned like, oh, they could be frisky or Indy will be super fun. I guess of the 5 teams that are talked about the most in the East, do you see a pathway to Indy kind of breaking into that mold? And you already mentioned before, like finishing with a home court advantage spot.
I mean, I think it's potential. I mean, you can't deny what the core 4 net rating is for the Milwaukee Bucks when Giannis and Chris Middleton and Brook Lopez and Damian Lillard are out there. That's very formidable, but I think that they're going to have other things to balance. And I think that there also is a potential where it's just like at one point in time, there might just be too much wear and tear. Like, I think Brook Lopez's game is going to age well, but that is a consideration. And I do think that they're going to have other things that they like. What seed the Milwaukee Bucks are doesn't really matter. They just need to get to the finish line and be healthy. That's what they needed against the Pacers in that playoff series. And I think that there is other counters that they obviously would have made in addition to just, having Giannis, who is arguably maybe the best player in the Eastern Conference. As far as the other teams, I think maybe I think you could probably pencil the others as being, more complete to a certain extent. I'm very rock solid on Boston. I was rock solid on Boston last summer. I really like the Knicks roster. That was the opponent that I was most concerned about playing the Pacers if they would have been at full strength, just because of the rebounding element. And then also now they have even more defensive versatility. I knew that Jalen Brunson was going to be a very tough matchup because as good as Andrew Nembhard is, he had one of the lowest blow buy rates in the NBA last year. You really have to have length to guard Jalen Brunson despite how small he is because of the amount of separation he creates. So I really like the Knicks there. Philadelphia, I might be a little bit lower on than consensus, I think, in some ways. And then Cleveland's probably the big one. Like, I can be talked into all those teams being better than the Pacers when everything's said and done. But I think Cleveland's going to have to show me something that their offensive ceiling can be higher than what they've shown at this point. And I know that they had a lot to do with injuries last year. And Darius Garland wasn't himself. Half their roster, not necessarily playing at the end of things. But the fact that they couldn't crack 100 points per 100 possessions against that Orlando defense is something that matters. And I do think that they have, strangely, a lot of specialists on that team, which is a good thing to have. But there's also times where it's like, because they have so many specialists, their offense can become somewhat predictable because so much of it does need to be initiated by Garland or Mitchell. And then Mitchell can kind of, I don't want to say tunnel vision, but it becomes like he feels like he has to take all of that on because they don't have as many other playmakers and ways to initiate. And I think that's why it's really going to be important what Kenny Atkinson does. Can they get more creation out of Evan Mobley? Would they be more willing to use him as a hub? Would they even do, some inverted looks with him? Some of those were successful in the playoffs. They just didn't do very much of it. So can I say that the Pacers are going to be better than any of those teams? No, but I do think that they can compete for home court advantage. I think that they're going to have to show us something at the defensive end of the floor for me to see them as like a true championship contender. But I don't know that I necessarily agree with putting them on the same tier with the Miami Heat and even the Magic to an extent.
Well, I think that I'm so out on the Heat, so they're in their own tier below everybody else for me. They're closer to Atlanta and Charlotte for me right now than Orlando or Indy. You are the closest that someone's come to talking me down on Cleveland this season because I might fuck around and pick them to win the East. I don't know if I'm.
The defense is legit. The defense is definitely legit.
One thing I want to ask you, what I'm having trouble is, so the Pacers still have stuff that they could trade. Like the Pascal Siakam trade was a home run in the sense that they only have one future first round pick that still needs to convey. We know we've talked a lot about how they could still use that wing. And they're probably going to give a chance to see if it can be addressed or if they're good enough with the current personnel. But do you think, based off what they did last year, so they make the midseason trade, but then they also kind of focus on talent retention this season, also then by extension limit some of the pieces that they could trade, that if they are to kind of finagle the roster at all, I'm talking about within the top 7 or so of players, that it's more likely to happen over the offseason? Or is this a team that views itself urgently enough that you could see them making them? It doesn't even need to get into the players who's giving up, but that they're on an urgent enough timeline to where they're going to consider to make another swing in the middle of this year.
I think the one thing that you can say about this front office is that they're both prudent but opportunistic. So I think that they recognized last year that what Tyrese was doing, they basically got 2 development years in one. They've said many times, like they've talked about, like they don't want to get intoxicated by success. Nothing that they did last year is guaranteed. This isn't linear. That they were opportunistic in terms of what they did in the playoffs. But I think they were watching Tyrese early on. They saw what they did in the in-season tournament in both negative and positive light. Like, we made it to the finals of this. There's a very clear hole here. We can get Pascal, by being patient and not trading for him over the offseason, which granted, it just sounds like Pascal was, trying to limit what teams could potentially trade for him last offseason because he was in the final year of his contract. But they got him in the way that he did, and the Pacers struck at the right moment. I think that could still potentially happen during the regular season this year. If they really hit the ground running and this group looks like they're ready, I could see them being aggressive during the middle of the year. If it looks like, hey, we weren't quite ready yet, maybe we did, maybe not necessarily a fluke, but maybe, some of it was just us being opportunistic against injury health, and it's possible that they might be a little bit more patient. But I think overall, if I was to say I have a hot take about this team, it's that the roster will not be the same at the end of the year. Because either they're going to get significant development from a few of these guys on the roster that's going to make it so that they don't need to consider those trades, or I think that they will consider the trades. Because your timeline does have to adjust. I think that Pascal's game is going to age well offensively. We've already seen some slippage defensively. But when you sign a player like that and you haven't won a max deal and it's a 4-year contract, you have to be thinking win now. So if the opportunity presents itself to be aggressive, I think that they will do it.
I think that that's the right call, and it's actually refreshing to hear someone like yourself who has that type of insight to say that they will be. Is there anyone else on this team I didn't ask you? Any really scorching hot James Wiseman opinions that you'd like to fire off before I let you
I will say this for James Wiseman. His feel can be very frustrating to watch. He's a very odd relationship with a pound dribble. I don't like watching games where James Wiseman gets a veer switch against TJ McConnell and goes to a fadeaway rather than, trying to get him under the basket. But in Golden State plays a very read-based, not a lot of pick-and-roll offense by comparison to other teams in the league. Detroit's play context and environment is what Detroit's play context and environment was last year. And he comes and plays with the Pacers, one of the most efficient pick-and-roll teams in the league. Like I said many times, he's a player who needs to be spoon-fed, and the Pacers have a lot of silver spoons. I think it's entirely possible that James Wiseman may not help the Pacers as much as they help him, but if either side helps the other, then it was worth the veteran minimum and the flyer. I don't think he necessarily addresses things. He only switched on like 5% of his screens last year. He's a guy who needs to play and drop, needs to play with somebody in hard rear view pursuit, and if Ben Sheppard isn't out there, I'm not sure that Bennedict Mathurin is necessarily going to be a great defensive pick and roll partner for him. But I think offensively there is some stuff there. Defensively, he's going to go from a team that was bottom 5 in pick and roll defense to a team that was bottom 5 in pick and roll defense. So I don't know that he necessarily answers those questions, but he gives them added size for position at the center spot, added depth, and there's potential that he could push Isaiah Jackson in training camp, and that's all for the better for them in that particular span and seeing what else he can do. So. If the Pacers help him improve, then I think it was worth the deal for sure.
Caitlin, this was wonderful as always. You're able just to tell our listeners / viewers where they can find you and all the fantastic work that you do.
Right. So my Twitter handle is at C2_Cooper. If you're watching on YouTube, it is there. And then if you go there, my link to Patreon is there. It is patreon.com/basketballshewrote. I still have 2 more summer projects to release. By the time you're listening to this, one of them may already be out. I did some extended ones where, like I mentioned, I wrote about, the different ways that the Pacers keep Pascal Siakam posted, where else that might go next year. I wrote like something pretty nerdy about time management in the way that the Pacers kind of play 3D chess with 2-for-1s. Some other stuff's just like basketball curiosities is the way I would term some of the pieces that I've been writing about. Just things that I've noticed, things where the game might be going, things that teams might be able to implement. That's kind of what these last 2 pieces are going to be headed into training camp. So hopefully people like those. And then I also want to throw in there just as a closing statement that like I was not aware that HardwoodKnocks, I don't know how I missed it, but they have t-shirts. Before I hopped on here, I ordered one of those. I'm pretty excited about that. I think other people should join me. I also think that like if you've come to this show because you for some reason wanted to just hear me talk about the Pacers, Dan's one of the best people. I truly believe that at doing these preview pods. The depth that he came up with for this outline, like these push me to be able to provide intelligent answers. And like the fact that he can do this for 30 teams, incredibly impressive. I've said it before, like I'm not somebody who really delves into like ranking pieces and some of the other stuff that he does with fake trades and other things, but I read his because the quality of the writing is that good and I enjoy the blurbs. So follow his work, follow Hardwood Knocks, and continue listening to the podcast.
I don't know what you're doing. Bleacher Report's never even asked me to do a fake trade article, so I have no idea what you're actually talking about. You're making me blush. Those kinds of words are mega appreciated. Anyone who is not subscribed to Basketball She Wrote, the links will be in our podcast and YouTube description as always. I say it all the time, even when she's on the podcast. Nobody does this better than Caitlin. She is a superhero when it comes to content creation for basketball in general. So follow her, subscribe to her if you do not already. As you know by now, though, I will be pestering you again down the line, but thank you as always for giving me so much of your time and all your insight. And I will talk to you soon.
Anytime.